At 5:42 on the morning of my daughter's wedding, my phone vibrated across the kitchen table. I expected a frantic message about flowers, caterers, or some last-minute crisis only a father could fix. Instead, I saw an email from Chloe. The subject line was just 2 words, "Dear Dad." I smiled when I opened it. I thought it was an olive branch. It was a dismissal. The first sentence said, "Dad, I think it would be better if you didn't come today." My thumb froze, hovering over the screen. The smile died before I could take another sip of coffee. I read the sentence a second time. I read it a third time, searching for some indication that it was a typo, a misunderstanding, or a bizarre joke. But the words remained exactly as they were typed. Cold, deliberate, final. Preston's family has a certain image. The email continued, the letters cutting into me like surgical steel. And I don't want people asking awkward questions. Awkward questions. That was what my daughter called me. I lowered the phone and slowly placed it face down on the table. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my coffee mug against the wall. I just sat in the agonizing silence of the kitchen, breathing in the smell of the dark roast coffee, and looked down at my hands resting on the oak table. They were large hands, thick fingers, cracked knuckles. There was a jagged, white concrete scar running across the back of my left palm from a rebar accident 20 years ago. No matter how hard I scrubbed, no matter what heavy-duty pumice soap I used, there was always a faint, indelible shadow of pipe grease buried deep beneath my thumbnails. These were the hands that had poured the foundation of the house she grew up in. These were the hands that had worked 70 hours a week to pay her out-of-state college tuition in full, ensuring she graduated without a single dime of student loan debt. These were the hands that had held her mother's divorce papers, steady and firm, so I could go into the kitchen and pack Chloe's lunchbox the very next morning without letting her see me break. These hands were the only reason she had survived her childhood with a roof over her head and a future paved in gold. And now, on the most important day of her life, my daughter had looked at these hands and decided they were an embarrassment. I picked up the phone again and scrolled to the final line of the email. "I hope you understand that this is not rejection, Dad. It's just boundaries. I love you, but I just need today to feel elegant." An email. She couldn't even look me in the eye to do it. She couldn't even call me to hear my voice break. She had drafted a sterile, corporate-sounding email to uninvite me from her wedding because my presence, my physical existence, did not match the aesthetic of the Harrington family. She didn't want a father. She wanted a prop. And I was the wrong kind of prop. I did not call her. I did not text her back to beg or plead or remind her of everything I had sacrificed. Instead, I reached across the kitchen table. Next to my coffee cup, resting neatly in a manila folder, was a piece of heavy cardstock paper. It was a finalized invoice from the Grand Belvedere, the most exclusive, hyper-luxury wedding venue in the city. The bold black numbers at the bottom of the page read, asterisk of $150,000. Directly beneath that, stamped in bright red ink, were 3 words, asterisk, paid in full. And next to that, listed under the billing contact, was the designation, asterisk anonymous donor. That was the exact cost of the champagne, the imported orchids, the string quartet, and the marble ballroom. That was the cost of the elegant, high society wedding my daughter had just uninvited me from. She thought the Harrington family was paying for it. Preston's father, Charles Harrington, had made sure she believed that. But Charles Harrington was a desperate man drowning in debt, and 3 weeks ago, he had quietly begged me to cover the invoice to save his family's precious reputation. I had paid it. I had paid it anonymously. Because I loved my daughter, and I didn't want her dream day ruined by her future father-in-law's financial incompetence. I stared at the invoice. The sting of betrayal in my chest slowly began to harden. The heartbreak of a rejected father began to crystallize into the cold, calculated focus of a self-made industrialist. Chloe was right about one thing. Preston's family did have a certain image. They presented themselves as generational wealth, old money elites who looked down on men who wore steel-toed boots. But I knew the truth. I picked up a second document sitting beneath the invoice. It was a massive 70-page legal contract bound by a metal clip. It was a notice of acquisition from Carter Industrial Holdings, my private LLC. Preston's family was not rich. They were a hollow, crumbling facade. And as of yesterday morning, my holding company had successfully purchased the Harringtons' defaulted $4 million private loan. I owned the debt on their massive estate. I owned the debt on their failing commercial properties. I owned the leverage that kept their entire fake-rich existence afloat. I folded the $150,000 wedding invoice and slid it into the inside pocket of my tailored, midnight blue tuxedo jacket hanging on the back of the kitchen chair. I did not reply to my daughter's email. A reply would have been too small for what she had just done. By sunset, Chloe would learn something Preston's family should have told her before they ever let her walk down that aisle. The man with the dirty hands had paid for the flowers. He had paid for the music. He had paid for the ballroom. And tonight, I was going to collect the debt that would destroy her new last name. There is a profound irony in being rejected for the very thing that kept someone alive. As I sat in my quiet kitchen on the morning of her wedding, staring at the thick calluses and jagged scars on my hands, my mind drifted back 20 years. I remembered a time when those hands weren't an embarrassment. I remembered when they were the only thing in the world that made Chloe feel safe. She was 7 years old when her mother, Diane, finally packed her bags and walked out. Diane was a woman who loved the idea of wealth but despised the dirty, exhausting process of building it. She couldn't handle the unpredictable hours of a contractor husband, the smell of diesel fuel on my clothes, or the constant financial anxiety of starting a new company from scratch. She wanted a polished life. I was a man covered in dust, so she left. She took half of the meager savings we had and moved to California with a regional sales manager. The first night we were alone in the house, Chloe woke up crying at 2 a.m. I remember walking into her small, pink bedroom, my muscles aching from a 14-hour shift, pouring concrete for a commercial warehouse foundation. I sat on the edge of her bed and reached out, gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. She reached up with her tiny, soft fingers and wrapped them tightly around my thumb. "Your hands are scratchy, Daddy," Chloe had whispered in the dark, her voice trembling with the confusion of a child who didn't understand why her mother hadn't kissed her goodnight. I had smiled, carefully stroking her hair with the side of my palm so the calluses wouldn't scratch her skin. "That's how you know they work, sweetheart," I told her. "They're scratchy because they're building a wall around you. As long as these hands are working, nothing bad is ever going to touch you." And I kept that promise. For the next 50 years, I worked like a man possessed. I didn't just build a company. I built a fortress of financial security for my daughter. I took the hardest, most dangerous industrial contracts in the city, the jobs other contractors turned down because the timelines were too brutal or the conditions were too harsh. I remember a winter when Chloe was in the 5th grade. I was contracted to repair the massive, ruptured high-pressure water mains beneath an old manufacturing plant. It was a miserable, freezing 48-hour continuous job. Sometime around 3 a.m, a rusted pipe flange snapped and sliced a deep, 3-inch gash across the back of my left hand. I didn't go to the hospital. I couldn't afford the downtime. I washed the wound out with industrial solvent, wrapped it tightly in black electrical tape, and finished the shift. 3 hours later, still wearing my canvas work jacket that smelled heavily of ozone, stagnant water, and diesel smoke, I walked directly into the elementary school for Chloe's parent-teacher conference. I sat in the tiny, brightly colored plastic chair across from her teacher, my taped hand resting on my knee. I didn't care how I looked. I only cared when the teacher smiled and told me Chloe was testing in the 99th percentile for reading comprehension. I walked out of that school feeling like a king. I thought my hands were my badge of honor. I didn't realize that as Chloe grew older, they would become her badge of shame. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, insidious poison dripped directly into her ear by her mother. When Diane realized that my small contracting business had unexpectedly blossomed into Carter Industrial Holdings, a multi-million-dollar enterprise, she suddenly decided she wanted to be an active mother again. She started flying in from California for holidays and milestone events, bringing with her a toxic, superficial worldview that equated human worth with aesthetic presentation. Diane couldn't attack my character, because I had never failed as a father. So she attacked my image. I remember standing in the kitchen when Chloe was 16, getting ready to take her to a high school banquet. Diane was visiting, leaning against the marble counter, sipping white wine. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the faint grease stains under my fingernails that I couldn't scrub out. "Your father is a good man, Chloe," Diane had said, her voice dripping with the kind of backhanded, patrician pity that makes your blood boil. "But good men are not always suitable for photographs. Make sure you stand on his left side tonight so the camera doesn't catch that hideous scar on his hand." It was a seed of embarrassment, carefully planted in the mind of a teenage girl desperate to fit in. And over the years, that seed grew into a suffocating weed. By the time Chloe graduated from her elite private university, tuition that I had paid in cash every single semester, the transformation was complete. At her graduation ceremony, the campus was flooded with wealthy, polished parents wearing designer suits and imported silk dresses. I had bought a new sports coat for the occasion. But there is no hiding the posture of a man who spent 30 years carrying steel beams. There is no hiding the rough, weathered texture of my skin. When it was time to take pictures by the fountain, Chloe hesitated. She looked at her friends' fathers, looking like Wall Street executives, and then she looked at me. "Dad," Chloe had muttered, her voice tight with embarrassment. Could you maybe stand at the edge of the group, or maybe put your hands in your pockets? Your nails look really dark today. I just don't want people staring." It felt like someone had driven a nail gun through my chest. The hands that had signed the checks for her luxury apartment, her semester abroad in Paris, and her expensive textbooks were suddenly too ugly to be included in her victory. Before I could say a word, Diane stepped in, placing a manicured hand on Chloe's shoulder. "Don't be dramatic, William," Diane had said smoothly, shooting me a cold, warning glare. "She just wants nice pictures. Let the girl enjoy her day without making it about your ego." So I put my hands in my pockets. I stood at the edge of the frame. I let myself be cropped out of the image of her success. And despite the disrespect, despite the quiet humiliation, I kept paying. I bought her a brand new car when she moved to the city for her internship. I funded her entire lifestyle while she built her career as a high-end interior designer and social media influencer. I poured thousands of dollars into her bank account, believing that one day she would mature. I believed that one day she would look past the dirt and the calluses and finally understand the magnitude of what I had sacrificed to give her a perfect life. I kept thinking success would make her grateful. I did not understand it was making her embarrassed. The more elegant her life became, the more desperately she wanted to erase the grueling, unglamorous labor that had built it. She didn't want the world to know she was a contractor's daughter. She wanted to pretend she was born into the upper echelon. And then she met Preston Harrington. Preston was everything Diane had taught Chloe to value. He was impeccably dressed. He spoke with the slow, arrogant drawl of old money. His family belonged to the oldest country club in the state. Preston was the perfect accessory to complete Chloe's transition into high society. But as I sat at my kitchen table, Sliding the $150,000 paid wedding invoice into the pocket of my tuxedo, I knew the dark, ugly truth about the Harrington family. They weren't old money, they were old debt. And they were using my daughter as a sacrificial lamb to save themselves from total financial ruin. To understand how deeply my daughter was manipulated, you have to understand the illusion of the Harrington family. On the surface, Charles and Victoria Harrington were the absolute embodiment of aristocratic grace. They lived in a sprawling neo-colonial mansion in the most exclusive zip code in the state. They spent their weekends hosting charity galas and drinking gin and tonics at the country club. Their son, Preston, had been groomed from birth to project an aura of effortless superiority. He wore bespoke suits, spoke in a slow, patronizing cadence, and drove a vintage European sports car that he liked to park conspicuously in front of expensive restaurants. To a young woman like Chloe, who had spent her entire adolescence trying to outrun the smell of concrete and diesel fuel, Preston Harrington wasn't just a fiancé, he was an absolute salvation. He was her golden ticket into a world where people didn't work for their money. They simply inherited it. The Harrington family welcomed Chloe with open arms, entirely because of how she looked. She was stunning, she dressed impeccably, and she had an eye for high-end design. She was the perfect decorative addition to their family portrait. They simply pretended that I didn't exist. During the 18 months of Chloe and Preston's engagement, I was invited to exactly one dinner at the Harrington mansion. I was seated at the far end of the table, and the conversation was intentionally steered toward European vacations and private equity, topics designed to exclude a man who had built his fortune laying industrial pipe. I didn't care about their snobbery. I only cared that Chloe seemed happy. But the polished, aristocratic facade of the Harrington family was entirely hollow. They weren't old money, they were old debt. Charles Harrington had inherited a massive real estate portfolio from his father, and over the course of 2 decades, his staggering incompetence had slowly bled it dry. By the time Preston proposed to Chloe, the Harrington estate was drowning in toxic leverage. Their commercial development projects had stalled. Their private lenders were circling like vultures. The neo-colonial mansion that Chloe was so desperate to be associated with was mortgaged to the absolute hilt, and the bank was quietly preparing to foreclose. They were bleeding out, and they needed a lifeline. I didn't know any of this until 3 weeks before the wedding. I was sitting in my office at Carter Industrial Holdings, reviewing the blueprints for a new municipal water treatment plant, when my private line rang. It was Charles Harrington. "William," Charles had said, his voice trembling slightly, tirelessly stripped of its usual aristocratic arrogance. "I am calling you as a father. This is profoundly humiliating to admit, but we have hit a temporary liquidity issue. The Grand Belvedere is demanding the final payment for the wedding venue by 5 o'clock today, or they will cancel the reservation." I leaned back in my leather chair, listening to the desperate panic of a man who was used to buying time with his last name. "How much is the final invoice, Charles?" I asked calmly. $150,000, Charles choked out. "William, if the wedding falls apart now, the social fallout will be catastrophic. But more importantly, Chloe will be absolutely devastated. Her heart will be broken." He knew exactly what button to push. He wasn't appealing to my business sense. He was weaponizing my love for my daughter. "Does Chloe know about this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "No," Charles replied quickly. "And for her sake, she shouldn't. She believes everything is taken care of. Please, William, for Chloe's sake, let the Harrington name remain clean today. If you can advance the funds, I swear to you, I will pay you back as soon as our liquidity opens up." I knew Charles Harrington was never going to pay me back. I knew a temporary liquidity issue in the world of high finance was usually a polite euphemism for total bankruptcy. But I thought about Chloe. I thought about the little girl who had held my rough hand in the dark when she was crying. I thought about how much this day meant to her, and how deeply it would crush her spirit if her dream wedding collapsed because her future father-in-law was a fraud. So, I did what a father does. I protected her. I transferred $150,000 directly to the Grand Belvedere. But I made Charles promise to keep my name off the invoice. I listed the payment under anonymous donor. I didn't want Chloe to feel like she owed me, and I certainly didn't want Preston to feel emasculated before the marriage even began. I just wanted my daughter to have a beautiful day. I thought Charles and Preston would at least possess the basic human decency to feel grateful. I was wrong. They took my money to save their public image. And then they immediately went back to treating me like dirt. The depth of their cruelty didn't become fully apparent to me until 2 days ago. Chloe had hired a high-end wedding planner to coordinate the logistics of the event. The planner, completely unaware of the family dynamics, had accidentally CC'd my assistant on an email chain regarding the final seating chart and photography schedule. As I read through the forwarded emails, looking for my name on the family portrait schedule, I found an earlier message in the chain. It was an email from Preston, sent directly to his mother, Victoria, and the wedding planner, just hours after I had paid the $150,000 venue invoice. The venue is secured. Preston had written. The contractor paid it, but Victoria is right. We cannot have him front and center during the reception. Make sure Chloe understands her father should not be highly visible in the professional photos. We need his money, not his boots. And Victoria Harrington had replied, agreed, let the contractor pay. Just don't let him become part of the photographs. The service entrance is around the back for a reason. I sat in my office and read those words until they were burned into my retina. Preston Harrington knew exactly who was paying for his elegant, high society wedding. He knew that the only reason he was getting married in a marble ballroom instead of a courthouse was because the man with the dirty hands had written a 6-figure check. But instead of feeling grateful, Preston and his mother had used that exact moment to manipulate my daughter. They had capitalized on Chloe's existing insecurities, whispering in her ear, convincing her that my presence would taint the aesthetic of the Harrington family. They took my money with one hand and used the other hand to orchestrate my complete erasure from my daughter's life. They didn't just teach my daughter to be ashamed of me. They had built a business plan around it. I am not a man who acts on impulse. You cannot build a multi-million-dollar industrial contracting firm by letting your emotions dictate your strategy. When you pour a massive concrete foundation, you measure everything 3 times. You test the soil density, and you map out the structural load before you ever dispatch the cement mixers. So, when I read those emails from Preston and Victoria Harrington, the emails orchestrating my erasure from my daughter's wedding, I didn't immediately call Chloe. I didn't drive to the country club and punch Preston in the jaw. Instead, I called Grace Miller. Grace was the chief financial officer and lead corporate attorney for Carter Industrial Holdings. She was a brilliant, razor-sharp woman who operated with the surgical precision of an assassin. When Charles Harrington had begged me to cover the $150,000 wedding invoice 3 weeks earlier, I had asked Grace to quietly run a background check on the Harrington family's financial status. I wanted to know exactly what kind of iceberg my daughter was sailing toward. 2 days before the wedding, Grace walked into my office. She didn't bother knocking. She closed the heavy mahogany door behind her, dropped a massive red-tabbed legal binder onto my desk, and sat down in the leather chair across from me. "Mr. Carter," Grace said, her voice entirely devoid of pleasantries. "Harrington Estates is in catastrophic default." I leaned forward, opening the binder. "How bad?" "Terminal," Grace replied, tapping a manicured fingernail against the top page of the financial summary. Charles Harrington took out a $4 million private construction loan 2 years ago to fund a luxury condominium development. The project stalled. The contractors walked off the job due to non-payment. The loan matured 90 days ago, and Harrington has missed 3 consecutive balloon payments. I scanned the documents. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just a cash flow problem. It was total insolvency. "What is securing the debt?" I asked, my eyes scanning the collateral annex. "Everything," Grace said flatly. "The loan is cross-collateralized. It is secured by the development land, their downtown office building, and the Harrington family mansion. The primary lender is a private equity firm out of Chicago. They are tired of waiting. They filed a notice of default last week, and they are actively looking to offload the toxic debt at a discount, just to clear it off their books." I sat back in my chair. The puzzle pieces suddenly locked together perfectly. Preston Harrington wasn't marrying my daughter because he loved her. He was marrying her because he was terrified. He was a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, looking for a lifeboat, and he had set his sights on my bank accounts. "If we acquire this debt through the holding company," I said slowly, "calculating the leverage, Carter Industrial Holdings becomes the primary creditor." "Correct," Grace nodded. "If you buy the paper, you own the debt. You control the timeline. You have the legal right to accelerate the loan, call in the full $4 million immediately, and begin foreclosure proceedings on every single asset the Harrington family owns." Initially, I didn't want to destroy them. Despite the anger boiling in my chest, I was still thinking like a father. I thought about acquiring the debt and simply holding it over Charles Harrington's head to ensure he treated Chloe with respect. I thought I could use the leverage to protect her from their toxic, fake-rich snobbery. Then Grace slid a single sheet of paper across my desk. "During the due diligence review of the loan portfolio," Grace said, her voice tightening with disgust, "the Chicago firm provided us with access to the Harrington data room. It included communications between Charles, Preston, and the original lender, where they attempted to negotiate an extension by proving they were about to secure a massive influx of capital." I looked down at the paper. It was an internal email chain between Preston and his father, forwarded to the lender as proof of their upcoming financial salvation. "Dad, stop panicking," Preston had written in the email. "Once Chloe is married, William Carter will fold. Contractors are sentimental men. They don't understand high finance. He's already proved he'll pay to keep his daughter comfortable with the wedding venue. Once I have the ring on her finger, we'll invent a cash flow crisis for the new business. And Carter will write a check to cover the loan, just so Chloe doesn't have to downgrade her lifestyle." I felt the blood roaring in my ears. I read the next email in the chain, this one from Victoria Harrington. "Just make sure Chloe understands her father should not be highly visible," Victoria had written. "He is a useful man, but not a presentable one. We need his money, not his boots." My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from a cold, absolute, terrifying rage. They weren't just snobs, they were predators. They had looked at my daughter, a beautiful, intelligent, capable young woman, and they hadn't seen a bride. They had seen an access point. They had seen a master key to my company's vault. And the most heartbreaking part of it all was that Chloe was helping them do it. They had weaponized her own insecurities against her, using her desperate desire to fit into their aristocratic world, to isolate her from the only man who had ever truly protected her. They had convinced my daughter that she needed to hide me, while they secretly planned to use me to pay their mortgage. I looked up at Grace. She was watching me carefully, waiting for the order. "Buy it," I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Mr. Carter," Grace cautioned, "acquiring a $4 million non-performing loan is a massive capital allocation. We are buying a legal war." "I don't care," I replied, picking up a pen. "Buy the paper. Execute the acquisition through the LLC. Do not notify the Harrington family that the debt has changed hands. I want the transfer finalized and the acceleration notice drafted by tomorrow afternoon. Grace nodded, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. She stood up, gathered the legal binder, and walked toward the door. "Grace," I called out before she left. She turned around. "Make sure you bring the final default documents to the Grand Belvedere tomorrow evening," I instructed. "I want you there right before the reception toast." Grace smiled faintly. "Understood, Mr. Carter." She closed the door, leaving me alone in my office. I looked down at my hands. The rough, calloused skin, the white concrete scar, the faint, permanent lines of pipe grease. They had not only taught my daughter to be ashamed of me, they had built a business plan around it. And now, I was going to show them exactly what happens when you invite a demolition contractor into a fragile, crumbling house. The Grand Belvedere is the kind of establishment that is specifically designed to make ordinary people feel like trespassers. It is a massive, sprawling estate featuring immaculate marble colonnades, crystal fountains, and a valet service that only parks cars manufactured in Europe. It is the architectural embodiment of everything Diane had taught Chloe to worship, and everything Preston Harrington used to mask his family's impending bankruptcy. I arrived at the venue precisely 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I didn't show up wearing denim work pants and a canvas jacket. I was not there to play the role of the tragic, unrefined blue-collar father stumbling into high society. I was there as the CEO of Carter Industrial Holdings. I wore a custom-tailored $3,000 midnight blue tuxedo. My shoes were polished Italian leather. I looked every bit the part of a wealthy industrialist. But I couldn't change my hands. As I handed my keys to the valet and walked up the sweeping limestone staircase toward the grand entrance, I could feel the rough texture of my calluses rubbing against the fine silk lining of my tuxedo pockets. At the top of the stairs, standing behind a velvet rope, was the lead wedding planner. She was a sharply dressed woman with an earpiece and a clipboard, frantically coordinating a small army of florists and waitstaff. As I approached the entrance, she stepped directly into my path, holding up a manicured hand. The planner said, her voice dripping with the kind of practiced aggressive politeness reserved for unwanted guests, "The main ballroom is closed for private photography. I'm afraid I have to ask you to wait in the lower lobby until the general reception doors open at 5 o'clock. I didn't move. I looked down at her clipboard. "My name is William Carter," I said evenly. "I am the father of the bride." The wedding planner's eyes widened slightly. She looked at my face, then glanced down at her clipboard. She quickly flipped through 2 pages of the master guest list, her finger tracing down the columns of names. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the entrance. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, her professional composure cracking just a fraction. I apologize for the confusion, but you are not on the immediate family access list." The bride requested a revised photography and family access list at 6 o'clock this morning. I stood perfectly still. The cold reality of the 5:42 a.m. email finally materialized into a physical barrier. "Did she remove the father of the bride?" I asked quietly. The planner swallowed hard. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. She didn't need to answer. The silence was absolute confirmation. My own daughter had systematically erased my existence from the official record of the most important day of her life. Before the planner could offer another hollow apology, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. Victoria Harrington stepped out into the foyer. She was wearing a stunning, silver-beaded evening gown that likely cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Her hair was styled to absolute perfection. She looked like the matriarch of an empire, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth. But as a man who had just acquired her $4 million defaulted loan, I knew she was nothing more than a woman standing on a trapdoor. Victoria saw me standing at the velvet rope. She didn't look surprised. She looked profoundly annoyed. She walked over to the entrance, completely ignoring the wedding planner, and stopped just on the other side of the rope. She looked me up and down, taking in the expensive tuxedo. Before her eyes finally settled on my hands resting on the rope, she stared at the thick knuckles and the faint scar with a look of undisguised revulsion. "Mr. Carter," Victoria said, her voice icy and precise. "I thought the email this morning was perfectly clear. Today is formal family only." I met her arrogant glare with a calm, unblinking stare. "I am her father, Victoria," I replied. "I am family." Victoria let out a short, dismissive scoff. It was the laugh of a woman who believed her bloodline made her inherently superior to everyone else in the room. Biology and presentation are not always the same thing. "Mr. Carter," Victoria said, her words slicing through the air like a scalpel. She gestured vaguely toward the side of the building. "You have done a wonderful job providing for Chloe, and we are all very grateful for your blue-collar work ethic. But Preston's family has a legacy to uphold. The service entrance is around the back, Mr. Carter. The guests are arriving through the front." It was a line designed to crush me. It was designed to make me feel small, dirty, and utterly unwelcome in their pristine world. But I didn't feel small. I just felt the heavy, comforting weight of the legal acquisition documents resting in the inside pocket of my jacket. Before I could respond, the oak doors opened again, and Preston Harrington hurried out. He looked panicked. He had clearly seen the interaction from inside the ballroom and rushed out to do damage control. Preston was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He knew I was the man who had paid the $150,000 venue invoice, and he knew that if I caused a scene, the entire wedding could collapse before the ceremony even began. "William," Preston said, forcing a tight, fake smile onto his face as he stepped past his mother. He reached over the velvet rope, attempting to pat me on the shoulder in a gesture of faux camaraderie. I stepped back, letting his hand drop to his side. "William, please. Let's not make Chloe emotional before the ceremony. We just want her to have a peaceful, elegant afternoon. You understand, right?" "I understand perfectly, Preston," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the dangerous rumble of a diesel engine. "But I am curious. Does Chloe know that you asked me to pay for this peaceful, elegant afternoon?" Preston's fake smile faltered. His eyes darted nervously toward the wedding planner, who was suddenly pretending to be very interested in her clipboard. "You offered, William," Preston lied smoothly, recovering his composure, "and we appreciated the gesture." "No, Preston," I corrected him, my voice echoing slightly in the grand foyer. "Your father begged. He called my private line in a panic because the Grand Belvedere was about to cancel the reservation for non-payment. I paid it to protect my daughter. I did not pay it to be directed to the service entrance by a woman whose house is currently facing foreclosure." Victoria gasped, taking a sudden step back as if I had physically struck her. The color drained entirely from her face. Preston's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine panic crossing his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to threaten me, to deny the accusation, but he never got the chance. "Dad!" The voice came from the ballroom doors. I looked past Preston and Victoria. Standing in the threshold of the grand ballroom, framed by the warm glow of the chandeliers, was Chloe. She was breathtaking. She was wearing a custom-designed ivory silk wedding gown that cascaded down the marble steps. Her hair was swept up in an intricate, elegant style. She looked exactly like the high society bride she had always dreamed of becoming. But her face was twisted in a mask of absolute horror. She didn't run to me. She didn't throw her arms around my neck and tell me she was sorry for the email. She didn't look at the expensive tuxedo I had bought specifically to make her proud. She just looked at me with a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious resentment. "Dad," Chloe said, her voice trembling as she clutched the heavy silk fabric of her gown. She looked frantically around the foyer, terrified that someone from Preston's extended family might have witnessed the confrontation. "Why would you do this to me today?" Why couldn't you just stay away like I asked? The final bridge collapsed. My daughter hadn't just been manipulated by the Harrington family. She had chosen them. She had looked at the man who had sacrificed his entire life to build her foundation, and she had actively decided to tear him down to appease a family of beautiful, arrogant frauds. I looked at Chloe. I looked at the $150,000 dress she was wearing, and I realized that the little girl who used to hold my scratchy hand in the dark was entirely gone. "I am staying away, Chloe," I said softly. I turned my back on the grand entrance, walked down the sweeping limestone staircase, and headed toward the parking lot to wait for Grace Miller to arrive with the demolition charges. I was halfway down the limestone staircase when I heard the frantic rustling of heavy silk behind me. "Dad, stop!" I paused on the steps, the cool evening air washing over the expensive fabric of my tuxedo. I turned around slowly. Chloe was rushing down the stairs, struggling slightly to carry the massive train of her ivory wedding gown. She looked frantic, glancing over her shoulder toward the ballroom doors to make sure Preston or his mother hadn't followed her out. She caught up to me at the bottom of the staircase, pulling me quickly into a quiet, marble-lined alcove just off the main valet driveway, out of sight of the arriving guests. For a second, looking at her flushed face and her terrified eyes, I thought the spell had broken. I thought she had finally realized what was happening, that she was going to apologize for the email, and that she was going to ask me to walk her down the aisle. Instead, she looked at me with an expression of pure, defensive anger. "I asked you for one thing," Chloe hissed, keeping her voice low so the valet attendants wouldn't hear her. "I sent you that email because I didn't want a scene. And you showed up anyway just to start a fight with Victoria in the lobby." The faint flicker of hope in my chest extinguished instantly, leaving behind a cold, dark void. "You asked me not to be your father in public," I replied calmly, my voice steady despite the absolute devastation I felt. "No," Chloe snapped back, her eyes flashing with a toxic mixture of guilt and arrogance. "I asked you not to make people uncomfortable, Dad. Today is supposed to be perfect. Preston's extended family is here. His father's investors are here. People who have a certain expectation of how things are done." I looked down at my hands, the thick fingers, the calluses, the permanent scars of a man who had built things from the ground up. "Do I make you uncomfortable, Chloe?" I asked softly. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at my hands, then looked away, unable to meet my eyes. That split-second hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. It was the confirmation of 15 years of Diane's poisonous influence, finally bearing fruit on the day of her wedding. "Your world is different from theirs, Dad," Chloe finally said, her voice dropping to a harsh, defensive whisper. "You don't understand how these people operate. You don't understand the nuance of this kind of society. I just wanted to fit in today. I wanted to feel like I belonged." Which world paid for this one, Chloe?" I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet alcove like a steel blade. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She crossed her arms over the bodice of her expensive silk gown, instantly retreating into the defensive posture of a spoiled teenager. "Please don't throw money in my face today," she said, her tone dripping with sudden resentment. "I know you provided for me. I know you worked hard. But you always do this. You always make it about what you bought, instead of how I feel." I stared at the young woman standing in front of me. She sounded exactly like her mother. "I was not going to throw money in your face, Chloe," I said quietly, the profound sadness in my voice completely genuine. "I was going to sit in the back row and watch you get married. You are the one who sent the email. You are the one who invited everyone in this city, except the man who earned the right to be there. Because you don't belong here," Chloe finally shouted, the truth slipping out in a moment of raw, ugly frustration. Before I could respond, the sharp, rhythmic click of high heels echoed against the marble floor. Diane stepped into the alcove. My ex-wife was wearing a sleek, emerald green designer gown, looking entirely at home in the superficial luxury of the Grand Belvedere. She walked over to Chloe, placing a protective, maternal hand on her daughter's arm, and then turned to glare at me with absolute contempt. "William," Diane said, her voice dripping with the familiar, condescending arrogance that had defined the final years of our marriage. "What are you doing? Are you actively trying to ruin her wedding day?" "I am having a conversation with my daughter, Diane," I replied coldly. "You are harassing a bride 15 minutes before she walks down the aisle." Diane countered, her eyes narrowing. She looked at my tuxedo, then down at my rough hands, her upper lip curling into a faint sneer. "We all appreciate that you bought a nice suit for the occasion, William. But putting a hard hat in a velvet box doesn't change what it is. For once in your life, love her enough not to embarrass her. Go home." I looked at Diane. I looked at the woman who had abandoned her 7-year-old daughter to chase a richer man in California, only to return 15 years later to teach that same daughter how to be ashamed of the man who had stayed behind to raise her. "I have loved her through hunger, Diane," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, low register that made both women flinch. "I loved her through fevers in the middle of the night. I loved her through tuition payments, through your divorce, and through the absolute silence of your absence. Do not confuse love with disappearance." Diane bristled, her face tightening with sudden, defensive fury. But she knew better than to push me when I spoke in that tone. I turned my attention back to Chloe. She was looking at the ground, clutching the silk fabric of her dress, refusing to make eye contact with the man who had built the foundation she was currently standing on. I didn't reach into my pocket. I didn't pull out the $150,000 venue invoice. I didn't tell her that Preston's family was bankrupt, or that I had just acquired the $4 million debt that was going to sink their entire aristocratic empire. If I told her in the hallway, she would think I was just a bitter, jealous father trying to sabotage her happiness. She would think I was making up a story just to ruin the Harrington family's pristine image. The only way to destroy a public lie is to blow it up in front of an audience. "You want me to stay out of the photographs, Chloe?" I asked softly. "Fine. I will not walk you down the aisle. I will not sit in the front row. I will not embarrass you in front of Preston's investors." Chloe finally looked up, a mixture of relief and lingering guilt washing over her face. "Dad, thank you. I promise. I'll make it up to you after the honeymoon. We'll have dinner, just the two of us." It was a hollow, empty promise designed to alleviate her own guilt so she could go back to playing the role of a high society princess. "But I am staying for the reception," I added, my eyes locking onto hers with a cold, terrifying intensity. "I want to hear exactly what the Harrington family has to say about legacy." I turned around and walked out of the alcove, leaving my daughter and my ex-wife standing in the shadows of the marble hallway. I didn't go to my car. I walked around the side of the building, toward the service entrance, and slipped quietly into the back of the grand ballroom to wait for the toasts to begin. The Grand Belvedere Ballroom was a masterpiece of manufactured elegance. Hundreds of crystal chandeliers cast a soft, flattering glow over the meticulously arranged tables. An imported string quartet played a delicate classical arrangement in the corner. The room was filled with 300 guests, the absolute elite of the city's social and financial circles, all sipping vintage champagne and exchanging polite, aristocratic laughter. I did not sit at table 1 with the immediate family. I sat at table 34, located in the far back corner of the room, directly next to the swinging doors of the kitchen service entrance. It was the table reserved for distant cousins, obscure business associates, and the people the Harrington family felt obligated to invite but desperately wanted to hide. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the elevated head table, where Chloe, Preston, Charles, Victoria, and Diane were sitting. They looked like royalty. They looked entirely untouchable. As the dinner plates were cleared, The low hum of conversation in the ballroom began to quiet down. It was time for the toasts. Charles Harrington stood up first. He tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon, projecting the image of a benevolent, wealthy patriarch. He gave a short, polished speech about the merging of two beautiful lineages and the importance of carrying the Harrington name into the next generation. He spoke with the absolute confidence of a man who believed his lies were untouchable. Then, Victoria stood up. She smiled warmly at the crowd, her silver-beaded gown catching the light. "I want to personally thank everyone who helped make tonight possible," Victoria announced, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "It takes a village to create something this beautiful. We are so deeply grateful to the vendors, the staff, and the wonderful people behind the scenes who worked so hard to bring the Harrington vision to life." She looked directly at Chloe and smiled. She didn't say my name. She didn't acknowledge my existence. She thanked the Vedard and the staff, lumping the man who had actually paid for the entire evening into the category of hired help. At the head table, Diane leaned over and whispered something into Chloe's ear. Chloe nodded, a small, relieved smile touching her lips. I could read Diane's lips perfectly from across the room. "See? This is better finally." Preston stood up. He buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, grabbed the microphone, and raised his glass toward his new bride. "They say you don't just marry a person, you marry a family," Preston began, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced charm. "And tonight, Chloe has stepped into a family that understands refinement, restraint, and legacy. We are not just joining in love today, we are joining in vision. We are building a future founded on the strength and the prestige of the Harrington name." The crowd began to applaud gently. I stood up from table 34. I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I walked slowly and deliberately through the maze of tables, the heavy silence of my footsteps cutting through the polite applause. By the time I reached the center of the ballroom, people had started to notice. The applause died down. 300 pairs of eyes shifted from Preston Harrington to the large, broad-shouldered man in the midnight blue tuxedo walking toward the head table. Preston paused, the microphone still in his hand. His smile froze. At the head table, Chloe's face turned paper white. She gripped the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles turning white. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. "Dad, please don't." I didn't look at her. I walked straight up the 3 carpeted steps to the elevated head table and stopped directly in front of Preston. I held out my hand. Preston looked at my calloused, scarred fingers. He looked out at the 300 guests staring at him. He had no choice. He slowly handed me the microphone. "I will be brief," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling like rolling thunder. "I know this family values appearances." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out the folded sheet of heavy cardstock paper. I opened it and placed it flat on the mahogany podium, directly in front of Preston and his father. "This is the finalized invoice for tonight's event," I announced to the dead-silent ballroom. $150,000. The venue, the flowers, the champagne, the imported string quartet. It was paid in full 3 weeks ago. Charles Harrington physically recoiled in his chair, his face draining of all color. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "William, this is incredibly inappropriate," Preston hissed, leaning toward the microphone, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You are humiliating Chloe. Stop." I turned my head and looked Preston dead in the eye. "No, Preston," I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. "Inappropriate is taking my money to pay for your wedding, and then letting your bride uninvite me because my hands did not match your photographs." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the massive ballroom. The wealthy, aristocratic guests stared at the head table in absolute shock. I saw Diane's jaw drop open, her eyes darting frantically between me and Charles Harrington. Chloe buried her face in her hands, a choked sob escaping her throat. But I wasn't finished. The heavy double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open. Grace Miller walked in. My CFO was wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit, carrying a thick, red-tabbed legal binder. She didn't look at the guests. She walked with the terrifying, inevitable purpose of a corporate executioner. Grace marched straight down the center aisle, climbed the steps to the head table, and stood right beside me. She opened the binder and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the official seal of the State Financial Regulatory Board. "Mr. Harrington," Grace said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent room without the aid of a microphone. "My name is Grace Miller. I am the Chief Financial Officer of Carter Industrial Holdings. As of 9 o'clock this morning, our firm officially acquired your defaulted $4 million private construction loan." Charles Harrington looked like he was going to have a heart attack. He gripped the arms of his chair, struggling to breathe. "That's impossible," Victoria snapped, standing up, her voice shrill and panicked. "We have an extension agreement with the Chicago firm. You can't just buy our debt." The original lender disagreed. "Mrs. Harrington," Grace replied coldly, "your debt was classified as toxic. We bought it at a discount." Grace turned to the AV technician stationed at the back of the room. She gave a sharp nod. The massive projector screen behind the head table, the one that had been displaying a looping slideshow of Chloe and Preston's engagement photos, suddenly flickered. The romantic images vanished. In their place, towering 20 feet high for 300 of the city's most elite citizens to see, was a financial summary of Harrington Estates. The bold red letters at the top of the screen read, *, critical. Outstanding balance, $4,000,000. Directly beneath the financial summary, Grace had instructed the technician to project the internal email chain we had pulled from the lender's data room. The text was massive, undeniable, and entirely damning. The entire ballroom read Victoria's words. "He is a useful man, but not a presentable one. We need his money, not his boots." They read Preston's words. "Contractors are sentimental men. Once I have the ring on her finger, we'll invent a cash flow crisis, and Carter will write a check just so Chloe doesn't have to downgrade her lifestyle." And finally, they read the desperate, groveling email Charles Harrington had sent to me, begging me to pay the $150,000 wedding invoice to save his family from public embarrassment. The illusion didn't just shatter, it evaporated. The Harrington family was instantly stripped of their aristocratic armor, exposed as desperate, manipulative predators who were entirely dependent on the charity of the working-class man they had tried to banish to the service entrance. I looked at Charles, I looked at Victoria, and then I looked at Preston. "You called me a contractor like it was an insult," I said into the microphone, my voice steady and utterly ruthless. "You were right about one thing. I build things, and when necessary, I also know exactly where to place the demolition charges." Preston turned to Chloe, panic completely consuming him. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the silk of her dress. "Chloe," Preston begged, his voice cracking. "Chloe, talk to him. Your father is trying to destroy us. Make him stop. Tell him to drop the acquisition." I didn't say a word. I just watched my daughter. Chloe looked at the massive projector screen. She read the emails where her new husband and her new mother-in-law had actively plotted to use her as a human shield for their bankruptcy. She read the words where they mocked the man who had worked himself to the bone to provide her with a perfect life. She looked at Preston's terrified, desperate face. "No," I said softly, answering for her. "They were already collapsing, Chloe. I didn't destroy them. I only bought the right to stop paying for the collapse." Grace stepped forward, holding the legal documents out to Charles Harrington. "As the primary creditor," Grace announced, delivering the final, fatal blow, "Carter Industrial Holdings formally declines to extend the terms of your loan. A full asset review begins at 8 a.m. on Monday. The Harrington Mansion, the downtown office building, and the commercial development holdings are now officially in the preliminary stages of liquidation. Grace paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the dead-silent ballroom. As of tonight, Grace concluded, the Harrington family no longer controls the debt that controls their assets. Victoria Harrington let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. The pristine, untouchable matriarch completely lost her mind. She lunged across the table, knocking over a crystal vase of imported orchids. "You filthy little tradesman!" Victoria shrieked. Her face contorted in absolute ugly rage, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You planned this. You came here just to humiliate us." I didn't flinch. I slowly raised my left hand and looked at the jagged white concrete scar running across my palm. I looked at the thick, calloused knuckles that had built the foundation of my daughter's life. "Filthy, yes," I said calmly, lowering my hand and looking Victoria dead in the eye. "Little, no." Chloe ripped her arm out of Preston's grip. She stood up, her beautiful wedding dress knocking over her chair. She finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. She finally understood that she hadn't married into high society. She had married into a sinking ship, and she had alienated the only man who could have bought her a lifeboat. Preston reached for her again. "Chloe, please, we can fix this. Just talk to him. Make him stop." I looked at Preston, then looked at my daughter. "There it is, Chloe," I said softly into the microphone, the tragic truth echoing through the quiet room. "Not 'I love you.' Not 'I'm sorry.' Just make him stop." I placed the microphone gently on the podium, next to the $150,000 invoice. I turned my back on the head table, walked down the 3 carpeted steps, and began the long walk back out through the center of the ballroom. As I walked toward the exit, the sea of wealthy guests parted for me. Nobody whispered. Nobody looked at my hands with disgust. They simply watched in silent, terrified awe as the man with the dirty hands tore down a dynasty and walked out the front door. I was halfway across the sprawling, manicured parking lot of the Grand Belvedere when I heard the heavy, frantic footsteps on the gravel behind me. "Dad!" I stopped, but I didn't turn around immediately. I listened to the sound of her expensive silk gown dragging across the rough asphalt. Chloe caught up to me, grabbing the sleeve of my tuxedo jacket. She was sobbing hysterically, her perfect makeup ruined, her ivory dress smeared with dirt from the parking lot. The aristocratic facade she had spent 18 months carefully constructing had completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, heartbroken young woman who had just watched her entire future collapse in front of 300 people. "Dad, I didn't know," Chloe cried, her voice cracking as she buried her face in her hands. "I swear to God, I didn't know they were bankrupt. I didn't know Preston was just using me for your money. You have to believe me." I turned to face her. I didn't reach out to hold her. I didn't wrap my arms around her to shield her from the pain. "I believe you, Chloe," I said calmly. "I know you didn't know about the debt." She looked up at me, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope flashing in her tear-filled eyes. She thought my understanding was the same thing as my forgiveness. She thought we were going to walk back inside, that I was going to write another check, and that I was going to magically fix the disaster she had created. "But you knew enough to remove my name from the guest list," I continued, my voice dropping like a physical weight. The hope in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, hollow shame. "They made me think," Chloe stammered, stepping back, desperately searching for an excuse to offload the blame onto Preston and Victoria. "Diane and Victoria, they kept telling me that you wouldn't fit in, that it would be awkward for everyone." "No," I interrupted, cutting off the excuse before she could finish the sentence. "They did not make you do anything, Chloe. They gave you permission to think what you already wanted to hide." She flinched as if I had struck her. She opened her mouth to argue, but she knew I was right. "You didn't send that email at 5:42 this morning because Victoria Harrington told you to," I said, my voice steady and unforgiving. You sent it because when you look at my hands, you don't see the man who raised you. You see the dirt you are trying to outrun. You wanted to play the role of an old money aristocrat, and you decided that your father was the only piece of your life that didn't fit the aesthetic. Chloe fell to her knees on the asphalt, sobbing uncontrollably. The great, tragic irony of her life was finally clear to her. She had sold out the only man who genuinely loved her to impress a family of frauds who only loved his money. "I will not let you starve, Chloe," I told her, looking down at her trembling shoulders. "And I will not let them use you to pay their debts. But I will not pretend today did not happen. You chose your world. Now you have to live in it." I turned around, got into my truck, and drove away, leaving my daughter crying in her $150,000 wedding dress in the parking lot of a venue I had paid for. The immediate fallout of the reception was absolutely catastrophic. With the truth exposed, the social hierarchy of the Grand Belvedere collapsed. The wealthy guests who had spent years admiring the Harrington family suddenly realized they were sitting in a room funded by a blue-collar contractor, drinking champagne paid for by a man Victoria Harrington had tried to banish to the service entrance. The whispers started before I even reached the highway. Guests began leaving the ballroom. The string quartet packed up their instruments. Preston Harrington did exactly what a coward does when the ship starts sinking. He abandoned his bride. Once Preston realized that I was absolutely serious about accelerating the loan, and that Chloe was no longer a viable pipeline to my bank accounts, the deep, enduring love he had toasted to vanished into thin air. He didn't even walk Chloe to her car. He spent the rest of the night frantically screaming at his father in the empty ballroom. By Monday morning, Grace Miller initiated the foreclosure proceedings. The Harrington mansion, the country club property, and the commercial development land were seized by Carter Industrial Holdings. Victoria Harrington, the woman who had sneered at my dirty hands, was forced to pack her designer bags and move into a leased condominium. Chloe filed for an annulment less than 48 hours after the wedding. The Harrington interior design firm, where Chloe had been given a prestigious executive director title, folded immediately due to insolvency. She lost her job. She lost the luxury penthouse apartment Preston's family had promised her. And because she had alienated me, she lost the financial safety net I had quietly provided her entire adult life. I didn't cut her off entirely. I kept her on my health insurance. But I closed the open tap of the family trust. If she wanted an apartment, she had to pay rent. If she wanted to buy designer clothes, she had to earn the money herself. She had to learn the value of the dirt under my fingernails. 3 weeks after the wedding, I was sitting in my office when my private line rang. It was Chloe. "Hi, Dad," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped entirely of the polished, aristocratic arrogance she had worn for the past 2 years. She sounded tired. She sounded like the little girl who used to hold my hand in the dark. "Hello, Chloe," I replied. "I got a job today," she told me. "It's just an entry-level drafting position at a mid-sized firm downtown, but it pays enough for me to cover the rent on a 1-bedroom apartment." "That's good," I said. "Congratulations." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. "Dad," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with the unbearable weight of her own regret. "I'm so sorry. I am so sorry about your hands." I sat back in my leather chair. I looked down at my hands resting on the mahogany desk. I saw the thick knuckles. I saw the white concrete scar. I saw the faint, permanent shadow of pipe grease under my thumbnail. I didn't say, "It's okay." I didn't tell her that I forgave her. "You were not ashamed of my hands, Chloe," I said softly. "What?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No, Dad, I was so stupid. I was embarrassed because they didn't look like everyone else's. I was shallow." "No," I corrected her. "You were not ashamed of my hands. You were ashamed of what they proved." "What did they prove?" Chloe asked quietly. "They proved that everything you were trying to become had been built by someone you were trying to erase," I told her. My hands are the receipts, Chloe. You wanted to pretend you were born on the top floor of a skyscraper. My hands proved that you were carried there by a man walking up the stairs. She started to cry. It wasn't the hysterical, panicked crying of a bride caught in a lie. It was the quiet, devastating weeping of a daughter who finally understood the magnitude of her betrayal. I didn't hang up, but I didn't offer her comfort either. I just sat in the silence, listening to her cry, and let her carry the weight of her own choices. My daughter lost a husband that day. She lost a house she had not earned, a name she had not understood, and a world that had never intended to love her. She lost the superficial, aristocratic illusion she had spent 18 months worshipping. But what she really lost was simpler. She lost the right to be protected from the truth by the hands she had been ashamed to hold. Before I go, I want to ask you a question. If you were William Carter, looking back at everything he sacrificed to build a perfect life for his daughter, would you ever forgive Chloe? Some people believe that a father's love should be unconditional. They argue that Chloe was just a young woman manipulated by a toxic mother and a predatory family of frauds. They believe that William should have hugged her in the parking lot, forgiven her mistake, and helped her rebuild her life immediately. But others believe that some betrayals are too deep to simply erase with an apology. Did Chloe lose the right to his unconditional protection the exact moment she chose the aesthetic of high society photographs over the father who paid for them? Does working hard for your children mean you have to accept it when they treat you like dirt? Let me know what you honestly think down in the comments. I read every single one, and I know this is a subject people feel very strongly about. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next one.